Gaslighting. Gaslighting represents the most insidious form of psychological manipulation. Imagine your mind as a stable building, and gaslighting as an invisible force slowly weakening its foundation, brick by brick, until you're no longer sure if the ground beneath you is solid or shifting. At its core, gaslighting works by targeting your basic sense of reality. The manipulator systematically denies your experiences, rewrites history, and questions your perception. They might move objects and deny doing so, tell you events never happened, or claim you're misremembering conversations. The power lies in the subtle manipulation, like a fog slowly rolling in until you can't see clearly anymore. The most dangerous aspect of gaslighting is its cumulative effect. Each small incident might seem minor in isolation, but together they create a web of self-doubt. The victim begins to question not just specific memories, but their entire ability to perceive reality accurately. This creates a devastating cycle of dependency. The manipulator often uses phrases that are calculated to undermine confidence. They might even use your past mistakes or insecurities as weapons, suggesting that your current perceptions are equally unreliable. They systematically work to create uncertainty in your mind. What makes gaslighting particularly effective is that it exploits our basic human needs. When faced with the conflict between our memories and someone else's insistent denial, our brains often choose the path of least resistance, accepting the manipulator's version to maintain cognitive harmony. Love bombing. Love bombing is like a spiritual intoxicant, a rush of affection so intense and overwhelming that it bypasses our normal emotional defenses. Think of it as emotional hypnosis, where the manipulator creates a dreamlike state of perfect love and acceptance, only to use this artificial paradise as leverage for control. The process begins with an overwhelming display of affection, constant messages, lavish gifts, excessive compliments, and promises of eternal devotion. The manipulator studies their target carefully, identifying their deepest emotional needs and desires, then presents themselves as the perfect solution to all of life's problems. What makes love bombing so effective is its timing and intensity. It often occurs when someone is particularly vulnerable. The bombardment of attention and affection creates a powerful addiction to the manipulator's presence and approval. The victim becomes emotionally dependent on this intensity of attention. The dangerous part comes when this artificial high becomes the new normal. The victim becomes emotionally dependent on this intensity of attention, making them vulnerable when the manipulator withdraws. This withdrawal isn't random, it's calculated to create anxiety and a desperate desire to regain the initial high of the love bombing phase. The manipulator uses this emotional dependency as a tool for control, making their attention and affection conditional on the victim's compliance with their wishes. The stark contrast between the love bombing phase and the withdrawal creates a powerful psychological hook, keeping the victim trapped.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Emotional blackmail. Emotional blackmail operates like a sophisticated form of psychological ransom, where the currency is guilt, fear, and obligation. The manipulator becomes a skilled emotional architect, building invisible cages made of the victim's own feelings and moral obligations. The power of emotional blackmail lies in its exploitation of values. The manipulator identifies what matters most to their target: family loyalty, compassion, religious beliefs, or personal integrity, and weaponizes these virtues against them. It's like turning someone's moral compass into a chain that binds them. The technique often follows a predictable pattern known as fog. Fear is invoked through threats of emotional abandonment or disapproval. Obligation is triggered by reminders of past favors or family duties. Guilt is generated by suggesting that setting boundaries or refusing requests makes you a bad person. The most insidious aspect is how emotional blackmail becomes self-perpetuating. The victim begins to anticipate the manipulator's reactions and modifies their behavior preemptively. They become their own jailer, restricting their choices and freedom based on the expected disapproval. What makes emotional blackmail particularly effective is its ability to mask manipulation as love. The blackmailer often presents their demands as being for your own good, or because I care about you, making it difficult to recognize and resist the manipulation without feeling like you're rejecting love itself. Silent treatment. The silent treatment is a form of emotional violence that weaponizes one of humanity's greatest fears, the fear of abandonment. It's like creating an emotional vacuum where normal human interaction should exist, forcing the victim to confront the terrifying possibility of complete disconnection. This manipulation tactic works by exploiting our fundamental need for connection. Humans are social creatures who require regular interaction for emotional well-being. When someone deliberately withholds communication, it creates a void that triggers primal anxiety responses in our brain. The power of the silent treatment lies in its ambiguity. Unlike direct conflict, which can be addressed and resolved, silence creates a state of uncertainty that the mind struggles to process. The victim is left wondering about the meaning of the silence, creating a mental loop of anxiety and self-doubt. What makes this tactic particularly cruel is its passive nature, which allows the manipulator to claim innocence while inflicting significant emotional damage. They might say, "I'm not doing anything," which is precisely the point. The absence of action becomes the weapon. The most devastating aspect is how the silent treatment conditions victims to blame themselves and work harder for the manipulator's approval. The relief when the silence finally breaks creates a powerful reinforcement cycle, teaching victims that compliance and submission are the paths to avoiding future emotional abandonment. Moving the goalposts. Moving the goalposts is a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation that creates an endless chase for approval or success. It's like running on a perpetual treadmill that keeps getting faster. No matter how hard you try, you never actually reach your destination. The manipulator sets up an initial goal or standard, but as soon as the target approaches achievement, they change the criteria for success. This creates a perpetual state of striving where the victim's efforts are never quite good enough. It's a perfect trap because it exploits our natural desire for achievement. But what makes this tactic particularly effective is how it combines hope with impossibility. The victim always believes that if they just try a little harder, work a little more, or do things a little differently, they'll finally gain the approval or recognition they seek. This hope keeps them engaged in the manipulation cycle. The psychological impact is profound because it gradually erodes self-esteem while maintaining motivation. The victim begins to internalize the idea that they're perpetually inadequate, yet they continue to strive because the manipulator makes each new goal seem achievable. This manipulation also creates a state of learned helplessness, where victims eventually realize that no matter what they do, it will never be enough. However, by this point, they're often too invested in the process to walk away. Triangulation. Triangulation is a sophisticated manipulation strategy that transforms relationships into emotional battlegrounds by introducing third parties into what should be direct communications. It's like adding a distorting mirror to a conversation where nothing is quite what it seems. The manipulator creates artificial competition by bringing other people into the dynamic. They might praise others while criticizing you, share private information with outsiders, or use third parties to relay messages that could be communicated directly. This creates a sense of instability where none should exist. What makes triangulation particularly effective is how it exploits our natural social insecurities. When someone suggests that others are somehow better, more cooperative, or more understanding, it triggers deep-seated fears of inadequacy and replacement. This fear then drives victims to work harder for approval. The strategy also works by diluting communication and accountability. By involving third parties, the manipulator creates confusion about what's really being said or meant. They can play people against each other while maintaining plausible deniability about their role in creating conflicts. The most insidious aspect of triangulation is how it creates crowded loneliness. Victims often feel alone in their struggles, even while surrounded by people who are unwittingly participating in the manipulation. This creates a paradoxical state that can be particularly difficult to escape. Future faking. Future faking is a sophisticated form of emotional manipulation that uses the power of dreams and hopes as psychological handcuffs. It's like selling someone an elaborate mirage to keep them invested in a present that serves the manipulator's interests. The manipulator becomes a skilled architect of dreams, carefully crafting promises that align perfectly with their victim's deepest desires. They paint vivid pictures of future homes, marriages, business partnerships, or life achievements, creating an emotional investment in a future that will never materialize. What makes future faking devastatingly effective is how it creates a psychological sunk cost. As victims invest more time and emotional energy into these promised futures, they become increasingly reluctant to walk away. The manipulator's excuses are always plausible, while they continue dangling new promises. The most insidious aspect is how future faking creates a form of emotional hostage-taking, where victims feel unable to leave because they'd be giving up not just a relationship, but an entire imagined future. The manipulator becomes the gatekeeper to all their hopes and dreams. The psychological damage often extends beyond the immediate relationship, as victims may develop difficulty trusting promises or planning for the future. The repeated experience of having dreams withdrawn creates a deep-seated skepticism about future planning in general. Projection. Projection is like a psychological magic trick where the manipulator takes their own negative traits and skillfully transfers them onto their target. It's a sophisticated defense mechanism that serves both to relieve the manipulator's own psychological discomfort and to control their victim. The process works by attacking others for the very things the manipulator is guilty of. A cheating partner might constantly accuse their spouse of infidelity, or a dishonest person might repeatedly question others' truthfulness. This creates a smokescreen of accusations that serves to both disguise and justify the manipulator's own behavior. What makes projection particularly effective is its ability to put victims on the defensive position. When constantly accused of negative behaviors, victims spend their energy defending themselves rather than recognizing the manipulator's behavior. It's like being forced to fight shadows while the real threat operates freely. The psychological impact is profound because it creates a distorted reality where victims begin to question their own character. They might start wondering if maybe they really are the problem, especially when the manipulator's conviction seems so strong. The most insidious aspect of projection is how it can spread into broader social contexts. The manipulator often projects their behavior so convincingly that others begin to see the victim as the problem, creating a form of social gaslighting. But isolation. Isolation is a gradual and methodical process of cutting someone off from their support system, Much like slowly drawing a net closed around a target, it's one of the most powerful manipulation tactics because it eliminates external perspectives. The process typically begins subtly, with seemingly reasonable requests about friends and family members. The manipulator might point out perceived slights or flaws in the victim support network, plant seeds of doubt about others' intentions, or create situations that make maintaining relationships increasingly difficult. What makes isolation particularly effective is how it combines multiple psychological principles. It exploits trust in the manipulator's judgment, plays on existing insecurities about relationships, and gradually shifts the victim's dependency entirely onto the manipulator. The most dangerous aspect is its self-reinforcing nature. As victims become more isolated, they become more dependent on the manipulator for social interaction and emotional support. This increased dependency makes them more vulnerable to other forms of manipulation. The psychological impact extends beyond the immediate relationship because isolation damages the victim's ability to form and maintain relationships. The experience can create lasting trust issues and social anxiety that make rebuilding a support network particularly challenging. Intermittent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement is perhaps the most psychologically powerful manipulation tactic, operating like an emotional slot machine that keeps victims hooked through unpredictable patterns of reward and punishment. It's the same principle that makes gambling addictive, applied to human relationships. The manipulator alternates between affection and withdrawal with no predictable pattern. This creates a powerful psychological response where victims become addicted to the highs while constantly trying to avoid the lows of punishment. It's particularly effective because the uncertainty of when the next reward will come creates a constant state of anticipation and hope. The most insidious aspect is how it creates a trauma bond between victim and manipulator. The irregular nature of the positive reinforcement makes it more powerful than consistent kindness would be. Victims learn to associate the manipulator with both intense pleasure and intense pain, making the emotional attachment extremely difficult to break. The psychological impact is profound because it fundamentally alters how victims process relationship dynamics. They begin to accept increasingly poor treatment in hope of receiving occasional positive attention. The unpredictability creates a state of constant hypervigilance, where victims are always trying to read and anticipate the manipulator's moods. What makes this tactic particularly devastating is its long-lasting effect on victims' relationship patterns. Even after escaping the manipulation, victims often struggle with healthy relationships because they've been conditioned to associate love with unpredictability and emotional extremes. Control through crisis. Control through crisis is a sophisticated manipulation tactic that turns the natural human response to emergencies into a tool for maintaining power and dependency. It's like being the director of an endless disaster movie where the manipulator is always the hero and savior. The manipulator creates or exaggerates manufactured problems, then positions themselves as the only solution. They might create financial crises, health scares, or social conflicts, always ensuring they're seen as essential to resolving these situations. This creates a cycle of dependency where the victim feels unable to handle life's challenges without the manipulator's intervention. What makes this tactic particularly effective is how it exploits our natural tendency to trust those who help us during difficult times. The manipulator becomes associated with safety and problem-solving, making it difficult for victims to recognize that the same person creating their problems is positioning themselves as the solution. The psychological impact is significant because it gradually erodes the victim's confidence in their own ability to handle challenges. they become increasingly convinced that they need the manipulator's guidance and protection. This created dependency becomes a powerful tool for maintaining control. The most insidious aspect is how this tactic can appear loving and protective on the surface, making it difficult for both victims and outsiders to recognize it as manipulation. The manipulator often presents their controlling behavior as care and concern, making resistance seem like ingratitude.